Hi everyone, happy Friday. I'm making this video as a substitute replacement for missing our class next week. As I mentioned, um, I will be away from the campus. Let me show you why that's the case. Where's the share? There's the share. There we go. Um, Ta-da! As I mentioned, that I will be going to Phoenix to speak at the CEO Club event on Tuesday. Unfortunately, I the flight to Phoenix, I had to fly it out on Monday, and I won't be able to return till Wednesday. As a result, we're not meeting in person next week, but this video of the lecture will be in replacement, and I'll post this on Canvas. So without any delay, let's go right to the first lecture topic, which is the economic nature. And I know we kind of delved into it during our first class discussion. We definitely asked the question of what is economics and why studying economics is a good return on your investment. As you can see in this graph, from a macro level, getting a four-year degree does pay off. And I can even quantify how much there will be. On average, it's a net worth gain of about $500,000 more in your lifetime. But of course, the world, it gets a little bit more complicated if you go deeper into those averages. And we also said not all the majors provide that type of return. In fact, three types of majors, you actually lose your investment, or you actually have a negative return on your education. So please avoid these type of degrees. And then you want to focus on these top tier majors. And these are right here. And I think we discussed the fact that whatever economics is that we're going to spend next 14, 15 weeks studying, it has one of the highest return on investment, educational investment you spend. So what is economics? We talked about the fact that according to ChatGPT, it deals with three key concepts or the words. Scarce, it deals with something with the scarce resources. It deals with something about unlimited wants and how we make decisions. And trying to put all these three concepts or the words together, we turn to my favorite philosopher, Chirac, and he's the one who says, John, if you really want to understand something, you got to go deeper, peel off the superficial layer, go deeper, and truly trying to understand what you're studying. So, what is economics? We started with the going very deep. We went to the work of cognitive psychologist, Dr. Miller. He's one who said that it is our nature to always want little more, and people spend their lives honestly believing that they have almost enough of whatever they want. Just little more will put them over the top, and then they will be contented forever. And I think we discussed it in the classroom. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that we have unlimited wants because we always want a little bit more than what we have because we believe that will make us happy. Unfortunately, we get trapped in this hedonic treadmill. You have a desire, you strive, you work for it, and you obtain it, you enjoy it. Unfortunately, this is just temporary state, and then you get used to it, and you want something else. And we're forever in this treadmill, many psychologists says. So we have unlimited wants. By the way, this is what I want right now. LC500, most unbelievable car. Of course, I teach at Nova, so I have unlimited wants. But the things that I have, like resources, money, and time, is limited. So I have, this is what I want, but I have limited means. That's why we have this logical statement that says our wants are going to be always greater than what we have. What I just described right there is the condition of scarcity. And whenever there's a scarcity, what you find in societies and communities and among nations, we see conflicts. So when you get a chance, please do watch this short YouTube video of a Nobel Prize winner who says all the conflicts around the world, when you strip away the superficiality of differences in religion, race, background, whatever it might be, it really comes down to scarcity of resources. And this is very depressing map I'm about to show you. I think I showed this map in the classroom as well. It tracks all the conflicts that's taking place around the world, and there are lots of them at any given point. And I'll dare you that if you drill down on each one, and if you do a deep dive and investigate ultimate source from economist point of view of that conflict, it is fueled by scarcity in resources. One of the areas I've been looking at is the scarcity of water. That has to do a lot to do with the global warming and everything else. And we expect to see much more conflicts in this region. Here's an example of the conflict that started a couple of years ago between US and Mexico. There were no issues for generations. And suddenly, with the global warming, there's a scarcity of water. So US and Mexico got into a conflict, and it just got settled. So if you're interested, you may want to read up on this. Uh, it got settled by US bullying Mexico that you got to compromise on getting your share of the water, or else we're going to impose a tariff. So, but it did get settled. Now, I just found this report that just came out last week from the UN. They're predicting that the number one scarce resource around the world ultimately is going to be water. And I'm expecting a lot of conflicts around the world due to shortage of the water. So whenever there's a conflict, it needs to be resolved. And this is where I defer to one of my favorite professors of all time at George Mason, Walter Williams, very famous professor at George Mason in economics. And he taught me in his classroom that, John, there are four ways of resolving conflicts. The first one is my favorite method because it's just so efficient and so clear. That's the use of violence. And then, of course, we also have culture and tradition as well. And I think I gave you an example of the conflict I had with my sister over my father's wealth when he passed away, whether it was going to be resolved by violence and culture. And of course, third option is government directive. Fourth one is the market. And I think I also mentioned in the class, the first lecture, that we're not going to talk about violence in this classroom because we're going to assume that we're all civilized. That's a big assumption. Second is I'm not going to be talking about culture and tradition simply because I'm not qualified to talk about it. And this is an econ course. It's not like an anthropology course, sociology course, and all that. For the next 14 weeks or so in this classroom, we're going to be talking about two different approaches of resolving conflicts, which arise from condition of scarcity of resources, which is government directive or command economy, as some of the textbook says, or the market economy. And right now, we're going to define market economy as you let the individuals and businesses make their own decision to resolve conflicts. Anyway, but if you're super nerdy and if you want to do a deep dive into discussion, I highly recommend this next book written by Karl Polanyi. It's the Hungarian historian. And at the end of the day, I found out that Dr. Williams, Walter Williams, did his research of the work that was done by historian Polanyi back in 1880s. And he pretty much said exactly the same, which is that there are certain ways of resolving conflicts, and then we can utilize the market, or you can rely on the government. Now, given all these options between the command economy and the market economy or the market command, which one is better? And now that's a trick question, though. When I use the word "which one is better," they're both good. because they do what they're supposed to do, which is resolve conflicts. So the question should be, which one do you prefer, given that they're both good at resolving conflicts? In order to answer that question, I turned to a Scottish philosopher from 250 years ago. His name is Adam Smith. I'm sure you may have heard his name. By the way, in fact, he's considered to be the father of economics, simply because at his time there was no subject topic of economics. But he is the first one to really systematically look into this question of how we deal with the scarcity and the conflict that arises from it. And after many years of reflection, Adam Smith published this book, very famous book, in 1776. It's called Nature and Cause of Wealth of Nations. And the title says it all. He says, look, if the command economy and the market economy, they're both the good ways of resolving conflicts. Which one do we prefer? Then he says, well, since we have unlimited ones, we should prefer the approach that's going to generate great wealth for everyone in the country. In other words, he wanted to find out why certain countries or nations are wealthy and there's a lot of stuff for their citizens to consume, and why other nations are poor and they struggle with poverty and deprivation and things like that. And he thought about it, published a book, and to convey that he was highly educated, deep thinker, he used a French word because back then, if you want to sound it smart, you spoke French. Previous to that, you spoke Latin. So he used the word laissez-faire. It shows up in his text as laissez-faire. And if you want to know the definition of laissez-faire, it means literally just leave it alone. Let it be. That's the American translation of it, I guess, or English translation of it. So what is it saying? Adam Smith is saying is if you want your country to generate wealth, you just let the people be. Let them make their own decisions. In other words, the command economy is more preferred than command economy, which means a government telling people what to do. So let's keep going. So was he right? Oh, by the way, Adam Smith, obviously, when he passed away, he came back. He was reborn. He came back as Milton Friedman, very famous professor at University of Chicago. He won a Nobel Prize, and he published his book instead of Wealth Nations. He said, "Free to Choose," and that title says it all. Free to choose. That says if you want to see wealth, you let people to make their own decisions without any government interference. And I put the warning sign next to it because I highly, I'm going to warn you, I guess, that says don't read this book. Stay away from this book because if you actually read this book, it's going to change your perspective on how the markets operate, and you're gonna become more like me, I guess. You embrace laissez-faire because this book really explains why wealth is created when individuals are free to choose on their own. So let's keep going. So was Milton Friedman, Adam Smith, were they right? In order to analyze in order to validate their idea, what I did was back in 2004, I collected the data from this organization called Heritage Foundation, and they publish, let me show you the report. They publish a index of economic freedom. And what that means is they rank all the economies around the world based on how free people are in terms of making their own decisions. So this is 2025 ranking. And as you can see, the most free country in the world, or to sound like I know what I'm talking about, like trying to brag, the intellectual aspect of it, most laissez-faire economy in the world. So that would be Singapore at the highest score. Then it's Switzerland, and then Taiwan, Australia, Estonia, Norway, and so on. And I'm proud to say I'm from South Korea. South Korea is number 17 now. It used to be down all the way to number 80, where it was the government of South Korea pretty much determined who goes to what, who goes to which school, and they pretty much commanded everything. And then now it's very, very laissez-faire in terms of their approach when it comes to economic decisions. And then the sad part is I've been doing this for about 20 years or so. United States used to be in top 10, but it looks like it dropped to number 26. So we're below Portugal and Chile and Lithuania and Canada and so on. So going back to our discussion, based on how free you are, I wanted to know how much wealth that economy generates. So we measure the wealth by using this thing called GDP, that's gross domestic product. So all the stuff that we produce in the economy, that's the wealth, divided by capita, that's per person. So this is the average wealth or average income of the country. And this is how free the economy is. And then all these dots or data points represents about 160, 170 countries around the world, including one of my favorite ones, like right there. There's a least free country in the world. Let me show you what that is. Scroll down. This is most amazing country in the world because there's almost no economic freedom at all. And all the decisions are made by the central government, and that is North Korea, number 176. And they have been consistently number one when it comes to using command economy versus the market economy. Now, let me move this. Let me go back to the lecture notes. So as you can see back in 2004, there's definitely a positive relationship between how free you are and how wealthy you are. One of the group questions you have to do is use 2025 data to see whether this relationship continues to hold. So based on this, it looks like Adam Smith's hunch that laissez-faire leads to more wealth, or Milton Friedman's idea that economic freedom means wealthier lives, a standard living, that seems to hold. So, yep, they were correct. Now, that being the case, you should say, Professor Min, are you sure about the causality? In other words, we could have a reverse causality. So what do I mean by that? Right now, our assumption is cause and effect. If you're free, you get more wealth. So if free, more wealth. So we think the freedom is the independent variable. But it could be the other way around. It could be that if you have more education, you get more wealth. And when you get more wealth, then you want more freedom. So that's a reverse causality. So which one is it? Is it more freedom, more wealth? Or is it more wealth, then you want more freedom? So whenever you have this situation where you don't know which way the causality goes, as an economist, just like any other scientist, we performed an experiment. So we took a very poor country, one of the poorest country back in 1960s, well, late 50s but early 60s. It was dirt poor, and we divided the country into halves. And in North, we instituted the command economy. And the South, we instituted the laissez-faire or the market economy. And 50 years later, we sent a satellite up in the air, in the space. We took a photo, and this is the photo of North Korea and South Korea in the evening. And as you can see, definitely there's a difference in wealth. And this experiment affirms the idea that more economic freedom generates more wealth in the system. So, and causality is also established this way. By the way, this is a picture of South Korea. I was there 2 years ago, staying at Marriott property. I walked out of my hotel lobby. I was blown away because that building over there on the left, that's a Starbucks, gorgeous. And then I see Bentley, I see Porsche, BMW. There were just so much wealth in South Korea. So yeah, laissez-faire economic policy it does work. All right, let's keep going. Oh, by the way, if that's the case, and the story seems to be so simple, more economic freedom, more wealth, then everyone else should be doing it. And yet, when you look around the world, there's a lot of poverty around the world. And you say, what, don't they know that Adam Smith figured out how to get wealthy 250 years ago? And the answer is, yeah, it's kind of mystery because if you look at the global map and you identify, you shade uh, uh, those economies, they're using more market economy versus command economy. You see the distribution like this. And then I'm just amazed that market economy is practiced like North America, Chile's down here, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, and Korea. Um, and then a lot of places around the world, they still use command economy. As a result, if I put a GDP per capita map on top of this, it's almost a perfect fit. When you see a lot of poverty, I would guess, as an economist's point of view, there's a lot of command economy going on versus the market economy. Okay, Patrick Terrell is the gentleman who leads the team at Heritage that produces uh, the Freedom Index at Heritage. And I'm so proud to say he graduated from Nova, taking micro and macro with me, and he transferred to UVA and got a degree in BS in economics. And then he got a job at Heritage. 10 years later, he's director, and he's very famous now because he is the one who's constantly showing that the global poverty has been going down because more and more countries are using market economy versus the command economy. So we hope this global trend will continue in the coming years. So, now that being at this point, I need to stop. So um, we need to kind of figure out, okay, where the story ends. So we know that we have unlimited ones, so we want to create much of wealth as possible. How do you do that? We figured out the answer 250 years ago, which is just let the people be, make their own decisions, and then the economy is going to generate more wealth. Now, most important question is when you have more wealth, does it make people happier? In other words, the wealth brings happiness, or can money buy you happiness? And that's a tough questions to answer. So I turn to very famous professor. His name is Richard Easterlin. He's known as the happiness professor because he spent 30 years studying what makes people happy. And pretty much at the end of his tenure, I think he retired or maybe he passed away recently. I got to look that up. Professor Easterlin, after 30 years of doing research in happiness, concluded two things. First, rich people are on average happier than poor. Now, when I read this in his book, I say, duh, I could have told you that. But the second part is really interesting. People do not become happier over their lifetime, even though their income tends to go up. I said, okay, let's put this thing together. First, rich people are on average happier than poor. Okay, that makes sense. But second, people do not become happier over their lifetime, even though their incomes tend to go up. So I'm trying to reconcile this two. And we can do that by looking at his graph, because he collected this scatter graph data in his book when he was doing his research. This is how wealthy economies are. GNP per capita, not GDP. The difference is GNP is gross national product. GDP is gross domestic product. So GNP is is a broader definition of wealth. All the stuff that you own gets added to GNP. GDP is all the stuff you own in your country. So we use GNP to be broader, and then this is how happy you are. And these dots represent different economies that he surveyed. And as you can see, there's a positive relationship, but it looks like it's curves up here. So if I try to fit a trend line through, this is what we see. And what he found is that as the G income goes up, happiness goes up, but at a diminishing rate. Eventually, it gets to a point that you reach a saturation point. That means beyond certain point, uh, making additional income, like getting additional $100 or $1,000, it does not give you the same satisfaction it did when you're starting off. And he kind of looked at the data. This was back in about 1970s data. He said it's roughly about $75,000. In today's money, that's about $200,000. So his conclusion is, and translating it to today's money, um, the additional income, the wealth that you get up to about 250,000, it's definitely good. It's positive. It's worth the pursuit. Beyond 250,000, then making additional income, generating additional income has less effect. So that's the limit, he's saying. But then this professor out of UVA published a very interesting study, 2021, and say, what happens if you go beyond 250,000? Does it just go flat? So you don't get any buzz at all? Or does it go up again? So you get additional satisfaction, if even beyond 250,000. Or does it go down, which means money makes you less happy when you get to a certain point? I mean, I know quite a lot of very wealthy people who are not happy. So maybe that's the trend. So which way does it go? So this economist at the UVA found that beyond 200,000, when you generate more wealth or you get more income, your happiness continues to go up all the way. And that's true all the way up to 625,000. And he stops his study there at 625,000. Main reason is when you start making 625,000, you're in top 10, 1% of the population in the United States. So we don't have enough sample to go beyond that. But I suspect, based on my reading, even beyond 625,000, we see a positive relationship. So that says more wealth, more life satisfaction. And that relationship continues all the way up to million and above. And of course, we don't have a data beyond that. So at the end of the day, we know what can generate more wealth. And it's a worthy pursuit to know how that really market economy works, because it brings more satisfaction in our lives or happiness in lives. By the way, if you want to get to the Charles Schwab's definition of comfortable life in the United States. By the way, this is material comfort, not spiritual. It says today you need about $2 million in your bank account, and you get to be very comfortable. I don't know what that means because I teach at Nova, but very comfortable life. So money does bring happiness. And if you're interested, you may want to read the rest of the more detailed findings. So money is good. Money makes you happy. And studying economics is awesome because it shows you how we can generate wealth. And so to end this lecture, we started the lecture with the question of what is economics? And here's our definition of economics. It's a studies concerned with efficient use of scarce resources to achieve maximum satisfaction of human material wants. So it makes sense, doesn't it? We're dealing with scarce resources. That was one of the key words from ChatGPT. And of course, resources are scarce because we have unlimited wants, and we want to maximize our happiness, so we have to use our scarce resources efficiently as possible. So what's economics? It's study of how we use our scarce resources efficiently as possible to maximize our happiness through material wealth or to satisfy material wants. So I think it's a worthy study. I think I mentioned in our first lecture that we have a group assignment. So here's our first group question. I want you to go to Heritage Foundation, use 2025 data, and reproduce the scatter graph that I made over 20 years ago. And we hope to see the same positive relationship between the economic freedom and wealth. The second one is I want you to read this very interesting article about how we deal with the scarcity of kidneys. Right now in the United States, there's long waiting list of people who want kidney transplant, but there's a scarcity of kidneys because the wants are greater than what's available. So the question is, how are we going to resolve this? Right now is the government controls it. Whenever there's kidney becomes available, the government has a way of assigning that kidney to the right patient. So that's a command economy approach. But as an economist, I think we should use the market approach. We should auction that off and goes to the highest bidder. And that way, the people who are donating the kidney could monetize it as well. So there are pros and cons. And I want you to read the article and give me both sides of the argument, I guess. And the last one is watch this short video of that Hungarian historian who's talking about the free market versus communism, fascism. I mean, this is classic argument, command economy, individual freedom versus communism, where government owns everything. Government makes all the decisions, including distribution. And then to me, fascism is another form of command economy. So that's the question about that. If you're really into economics, you may want to listen to this wonderful lecture about command economy or the Communist Manifesto, because in economics, everything you do has cost associated with it. And market economy does generate wealth, but one of the problems with that is income inequality. How are we going to deal with that? And we'll have discussion about that, I think, next lecture. And I think that is it. Oh, Adam Smith again. And then, this is a nice letter that Adam Smith would have written if he was alive today. So I used AI to generate a letter that Adam Smith would have written to his friends today. So, my dear friends, so if you want to get a letter from Adam Smith, here it is. I hope you enjoy it. And that is it. So I'm going to post this lecture on Zoom. With one or two discussion questions for you to consider. Again, I apologize for missing the class, but it looks like we may not have a class next week because of the snow. If that's the case, then we're going to use this as a substitute so we don't fall behind in our semester. So I will see you when I come back. That's the week of February 2nd. So have a very nice weekend and week, and hope we don't get too much snow on Sunday. Yep, bye.